What would you say is the best swing-wing fighter jet ever made? If you're a die-hard aviation fan, then I bet your answer is the F-14 Tomcat, unless you're perhaps a big fan of the F-111 and its dump and burn flame-throwing tricks at air shows. But for me, growing up in the UK and going to lots of UK air shows, I quickly fell in love with the Tornado. And believe it or not, neither the F-14 or the F-111 were built in as larger numbers as the aircraft that we're going to look at today. And that's incredible in itself, because the design of this aircraft involves so many competing requirements, so much compromise, that it's a miracle it was made at all. And yet, the Tornado stayed in production for nearly 2 decades, and it's been in service for 47 years and counting. The story of the aircraft starts in the 1960s, and to regular viewers of this channel, the early part of its inception might sound a bit familiar. We recently made a video about the Harrier jump jet where we explained that Western military planners had a big dilemma. They believed that if war ever broke out in Europe, air bases would be struck in the opening hours of the conflict, while thousands of Soviet tanks and armoured vehicles surged westward across the plains of Germany. Any aircraft that hoped to stop them would have to survive one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the world. Now, obviously, the Harrier and its ability to take off and land vertically would be very handy to have in such an environment. But for NATO, there were missions that a small plane like the Harrier simply couldn't do. For example, these planners wanted to be able to retaliate after such an attack by hitting targets deep within the Soviet Union, which required larger fighter bombers and preferably very fast ones. The thing is, even if these bombers could take off safely from their damaged bases, they would still have a really hard job to do. Soviet radar could detect aircraft hundreds of miles away, guiding layers of long-range surface-to-air missiles and interceptor fighters towards them long before they reached their targets. So, if NATO wanted to strike back, it would have to find another way. And the aircraft that Europe built to do this was the Panavia Tornado. And you only have to look at the aircraft it replaced to understand how revolutionary it truly was. In 1965, Britain cancelled the TSR-2, a cutting-edge supersonic bomber, and wanted to buy F-111s in its place. But that contract was also cancelled due to cost overruns, leaving Britain with much older and less capable aircraft like the Blackburn Buccaneer. By the late 1960s, other European countries were also using frontline strike aircraft that had been designed during the early jet era and were fast approaching the limits of what they could do. Aircraft like the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter that had been built primarily as a high-speed interceptor before being adapted into the strike role. At least the F-104 was fast, but simply flying fast no longer guaranteed survival. Because for years, the Soviet Union invested and planned against exactly this kind of attack. Long-range surveillance radars, interceptor aircraft, and multiple layers of surface-to-air missiles were all connected into a network designed to make conventional air attacks extraordinarily dangerous. And remember, there was also that small matter of attacks against Europe's air bases to consider. Whatever the Europeans would come up with would need to be able to take off and land on shorter runways, which we'll get back to. Building an aircraft capable of surviving that kind of environment would be enormously expensive, and for Europeans' air forces, it quickly became obvious that splitting efforts and developing entirely separate designs just simply wasn't very clever. So, in 1968, 6 countries, Britain, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Canada, and the Netherlands launched a program called the Multi-Role Combat Aircraft, or MRCA, hoping to share both the cost and the technological burden of developing an expensive and competitive multi-role fighter aircraft. However, that broad coalition proved really short-lived when Belgium and Canada soon withdrew from the project, and the Netherlands eventually left the program too. Like Belgium, the Netherlands would later buy the F-16 instead, which just left Britain, West Germany and Italy. That split was an early obstacle, but frankly, even with only 3 countries remaining, reconciling their competing visions and demands would prove almost as difficult as designing the aircraft itself. The organisation that the 3 countries created to manage the project became known as Panavia. So, let's do a recap on what Panavia's new aircraft would need to be able to do. This multi-role combat aircraft would have to take off from relatively short runways, or maybe from one half of a damaged runway, whilst carrying a heavy fuel and weapons load. It would need to cruise efficiently over long distances at subsonic economical speeds to extend its range, but then be able to accelerate to more than twice the speed of sound when it needed. The Tornado would then need to be able to descend to just a few hundred feet above the ground, still flying fast, weaving its way through hills and valleys in daytime or in total darkness and in any weather. Each one of these requirements would be challenging on their own. Trying to satisfy all of them at once was something else entirely. And that's if we assume that the three partner countries wanted to use the jets in exactly the same way. And we're going to get back to that bit in a moment. Now, the biggest challenge in getting the aircraft to try and do all of these things lay in the wing design. Now obviously, good takeoff and landing performance relies heavily on having large wings that can produce plenty of lift. But if you then try and fly fast with these wings, you now have to work against significant drag. Highly swept wings solve that problem and perform exceptionally well in the supersonic regime, but they make takeoff and landings much more difficult, particularly with a heavy fuel load or weapons. But that is exactly where the wing sweep mechanism comes in, as we saw in the F-14. During the takeoff and landing, the wings remained fully extended to maximise lift. But as the aircraft accelerated, the wings were gradually swept rearwards, reducing drag and allowing the Tornado to fly at supersonic speeds. But with that said, the Tornado's wing has a couple of peculiarities. Firstly, in the Tomcat, the wing sweep mechanism was automatic. Unless the pilot chose to override the mechanism, the wings would position themselves appropriately depending on the aircraft's speed. But this wasn't really the case with the Tornado. With the exception of some of the air defense variants, which I'll get back to in a moment, most Tornadoes in service required the pilot to select the position of the wings manually as the aircraft's speed changed. Secondly, unlike the Tomcat, but like the F-111, the Tornado carries weapons and fuel tanks in the sweeping part of the wing, which means that the pylons in that wing section have to rotate to keep the stores pointing forward. And that makes the already complicated swing wing design even more complex. Now, this wing allowed the aircraft to take off and land relatively slowly, but for the landing in particular, the Tornado had another trick up its sleeve: its engines. And I'll explain that after this. Running a business sounds exciting, until you're 3 months in and drowning in a chaotic sea of tech tools that barely talk to each other. See, you need a website, a way of taking payments, inventory tracking, accounting, and so much more. Sure, at first you stitch together a bunch of different tools, hacking ways to get them to integrate, but soon enough things are messy, time consuming, and you feel more like a dishevelled undergraduate student than a slick business owner. But that's where today's sponsor, Odoo, saves the day. Their e-commerce app has everything you need to set up your online business in a breeze in one intuitive platform. Here's how it works. You go through Odoo's configurator, answer a few questions about your business, and an AI builds your basic website structure for you. From there, you can customize it by dragging and dropping content to make it yours. Add your product names, prices, and a few pics in just a few clicks, and then customize the product page with content blocks. And finally, set your shipping methods and payment providers, and you're ready to take your first sale. Your first app is free for life, with unlimited hosting and support, plus a free personalized domain for a year. So if you're thinking of launching an e-commerce site, now is the time. So head to the link in the description below or scan this QR code to get your free app and to try it out for yourself. Thanks Odoo for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the Tornado. The Tornado is powered by two newly developed RB199 afterburning turbofan engines. And besides providing enough thrust to push the aircraft to a speed of around Mach 2.2, they're also designed with wartime operations very much in mind. The RB199 has a modular construction with 16 modules in total, which means that during maintenance, a troublesome module can be replaced individually with a good module and the engine can be refitted quickly, allowing the aircraft to return to service, and the maintenance crews can then take their time to fix the bad module. This engine, the RB199, was built by Turbo Union, which was a consortium of Rolls-Royce, MTU in Germany, and Air Italia in Italy. Some of you might know that the RB prefix in an engine usually means that it's a Rolls-Royce design, and it is a free-spool turbofan, which is another Rolls-Royce feature. Rolls-Royce used their experience here from previous designs, but they were by no means alone in developing this engine. They had a 40% share in this partnership, with 20% for Air Italia and another 40% for MTU. And it was MTU that designed, amongst other things, a feature that you don't often see in many fighter jets, the thrust reverser. Like I said, this aircraft had to be able to land on short runways, and the bucket-style thrust reversers it uses are very similar to those used in many business jets or in the earliest Boeing 737s. Now, the Tornado isn't the only fighter with reversers, but they are one of its signature features. But perhaps one of the aircraft's most impressive features was its terrain-following radar. This continuously scans the ground ahead, and the system could then identify rising features and automatically command the aircraft to climb and descend while maintaining an extremely low altitude. And this was a really key feature for an aircraft that would need to spend a lot of the time flying at treetop levels, day and night at more than 600 knots. Now, the system handled much of that work itself, allowing the crew to concentrate on navigation, identifying threats, and preparing for the attack ahead. And I say crew here because even with that level of automation, the workload remained far too high for a single pilot. The Tornado was always meant to have a crew of 2, allowing the pilot to focus on flying the aircraft, while the navigator manages the radar, the navigation systems, electronic warfare equipment, and its weapons. And taken together, those design choices produced exactly the aircraft NATO had envisioned. The Tornado wasn't intended to be an agile dogfighter or an air superiority fighter, well, at least not to start with. But as the aircraft entered service, it quickly became apparent that while Britain, West Germany and Italy had agreed on a common airframe, they hadn't agreed on exactly how they intended to use it. As impressive as the Tornado's engineering was, the compromises that produced it didn't end once the first prototype took to the air. For Britain, the Tornado's primary mission remained deep strike. The Royal Air Force expected its aircraft to fly hundreds of miles into Warsaw Pact territory at extremely low heights, attacking airfields, bridges, command centres and other critical infrastructure before escaping at high speed. So, range, navigation systems and the ability to operate at night and in poor weather were absolutely paramount. But West Germany, for example, viewed the problem somewhat differently, because they expected their air force to fight much closer to home, supporting NATO ground forces as they attempted to slow or halt a Soviet advance through Central Europe. So West Germany placed a much greater emphasis on tactical strikes against advancing armoured formations, rather than the long-range strategic missions that dominated British thinking. And Italy was somewhere between those two positions. Its geography demanded an aircraft capable of operating over both land and sea to perform the same low-level strike missions. Fortunately though, the engineers had managed to design a platform that was flexible enough to accommodate all of those missions, and before long, each nation began adapting the Tornado to suit its own needs. The original version became known as the Tornado IDS, which stood for Interdictor Strike. Now this was an aircraft all 3 partner nations had originally set out to build, and it formed the backbone of the Tornado fleet. It was optimised for low-level attack, capable of carrying everything from conventional bombs to anti-ship missiles, and later in its career, precision-guided weapons, all while having a limited capability to fight and defend itself if it needed. But then came another big challenge for the multinational partnership. Very early in the aircraft's development, Britain decided that it still needed a replacement for the English Electric Lightning and its F4 Phantom in the air defence role, even though that requirement had never really been part of the original agreement. So instead of funding an entirely new aircraft, the British decided to adapt the Tornado into a long-range interceptor. Germany and Italy, however, were not interested in this, but Saudi Arabia would eventually become the only export customer operating both the Interceptor and Strike variants alongside the original partner nations. Italy did get some of them much later on, but those jets were actually leased from the British. Now, the air defence variant, or the ADV, still looked very much like a Tornado, but there was actually an extensive redesign of the IDS version. Its nose cone was stretched to accommodate a different radar, and the middle of the fuselage was also lengthened to allow it to carry more fuel for the endurance needed to fly long patrols over the North Sea. And there was an added bonus here too. It turned out that this lengthening of the fuselage also reduced drag, allowing the ADV to accelerate faster in supersonic flight, which the aircraft designers were not actually expecting. Overall, the ADV's weapon system was built around long-range radar-guided missiles rather than bombs, which meant that it had to lose one of its cannons to make room for these extra avionics. But Britain wasn't alone in changing its mind about missions and roles. Germany's priorities also changed in a completely different direction. The sophisticated Soviet surface-to-air missile system that forced a Tornado to approach its targets while flying really low became even more sophisticated in the 1980s. Gradually, NATO decided that destroying enemy radars and blinding the enemy would be one of the first and most important tasks of any future conflict. And in response to this, Germany developed another specialised Tornado, known as the ECR, or Electronic Combat and Reconnaissance variant. The ECR carried electronic warfare equipment used to integrate anti-radiation missiles capable of homing in on hostile radar emissions. This meant that the ECR became one of NATO's premier suppression of enemy air defence aircraft, what the Americans call a wild weasel. But unlike the ADV, the ECR generally retained the fuselage of the original IDS variant. Even so, what had begun as a compromise between three nations had evolved into three distinctly different aircraft, and each one of these nations used at least two of them. The variants shared the same basic airframe, engines with small variations, and broadly the same flying qualities, but each had been shaped by the different strategic priorities of the country that operated it. And that flexibility would soon be tested in the largest air campaign since the Second World War. An irony with the Tornado was that by the time it entered frontline service in the early 1980s, it represented one of the most sophisticated combat aircraft anywhere in the world. But the war that the Tornado had been designed to fight never really arrived. As the Soviet Union began to weaken during the second half of the 1980s, the Berlin Wall fell, the Warsaw Pact collapsed, and the conflict that had shaped every aspect of the Tornado's design simply disappeared. Instead of racing across the forests and river valleys of Eastern Europe to attack Soviet targets, Germany reunified, and the German Luftwaffe found itself flying Tornadoes to bases across eastern Germany that it once planned to bomb. But then came the 2nd of August 1990, when Iraq invaded neighbouring Kuwait and triggered a massive international response. Over the following months, a coalition of more than 30 nations assembled in the Gulf, and among the aircraft deployed there were Tornadoes from Britain, Saudi Arabia and Italy. 3 different air forces would now take the aircraft into combat for the very first time. Now, the setting was different, but the first combat mission assigned to the Tornado looked almost exactly like the Cold War scenario that its designers had imagined 2 decades earlier. Coalition planners needed Iraqi air bases disabled before the Iraqi Air Force would meaningfully challenge the coming offensive. Flying at very low altitude under the cover of darkness, Tornado crews attacked Iraqi runways using specialised JP-233 runway denial weapons before escaping at high speed, just as they had long expected to do against Warsaw Pact airfields. But this did not go well. During the opening days of Operation Desert Storm, Royal Air Force Tornadoes suffered painful losses while carrying out these low-level attacks. The aircraft itself had performed as intended, but modern surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery and shoulder-fired weapons made flying directly over heavily defended targets at just a few hundred feet far more dangerous than Cold War planners had ever anticipated. So, rather than continuing to accept those losses, planners and crews were quick to adapt. The Tornado was shifted away from its lowest level attack profiles and increasingly employed medium altitude attacks, using precision guided weapons and improved targeting systems. And it turned out to be a remarkably successful transition, allowing the aircraft to remain an effective strike platform throughout the remainder of the conflict, whilst dramatically improving its survivability. The aircraft itself had not become obsolete, but the assumptions that had shaped its original mission had. Precision-guided weapons had become accurate enough that pilots no longer needed to race across hostile airfields at rooftop height to achieve the desired effect. But far from ending the Tornado's career, the Gulf War marked the beginning of its evolution. Over the following 3 decades, the aircraft would continue serving over the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya and Syria, constantly receiving new sensors, weapons and avionics that kept it relevant long after the Cold War had ended. And in many ways, it was that ability to adapt that became the Tornado's greatest strength. What had begun as a complicated compromise between three European nations could easily have become an aircraft that satisfied nobody, but instead it proved remarkably flexible. It evolved from a specialised low-level strike aircraft into a precision attack platform, into an interceptor, an electronic warfare aircraft, and one of NATO's most capable suppression of enemy air defence platforms. But today, despite that, the Tornado is gradually disappearing from European service as aircraft like the Eurofighter Typhoon and the F-35 assume many of its remaining responsibilities. Germany do still operate the type while it prepares for retirement later this decade, and Saudi Arabia also continues to fly them, but will likely replace them in the next few years, bringing to a close a remarkable operational career. Looking back, it's tempting to remember the Tornado just for its variable sweep wings or the dramatic images of it skimming just a few feet above the ground. Those features certainly did make it recognisable, but ultimately they're not what made it successful. The Tornado was successful because it never stood still. Designed for one war, but it fought another. Built around tactics that eventually became obsolete, it adapted to entirely new ways of fighting. Its evolution involved a good bit of politics, but it ultimately became a successful multinational combat aircraft, proving that sometimes the best engineering solutions are not the ones that perfectly satisfy a single customer, but the ones that are flexible enough to satisfy many. The Tornado was a compromise, but one that actually worked and evolved to keep working. But what do you think? Have you ever seen the Tornado display, or have you been fortunate enough to fly one? What's your favourite swing wing jet? Let us know in the comments below. I'm Ben Watts, you're watching Mentor Now. Have an amazing week, and I will see you next time.